On a gray morning in early April 1911, the air in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, was heavy with the scent of coal smoke and starch. The town bustled with industry, its workers rising early to tend to textile mills, rail depots, and more quietly to laundries that churned beneath the steady rhythm of modern life. At the heart of this quiet storm of steam and soap was the Elm Street Industrial Laundry, a four-story red brick building built in the early 1900s. This wasn't your neighborhood cleaner. Elm Street handled linens for the region's hospitals, hotels, and railways. Trunks of white sheets came in soiled, left spotless, and were carted away by horse-drawn drays. But on April 9, 1911, something else left the building. Something no one had expected to vanish. The missing metal. It wasn't cash, not in the usual sense. What disappeared was over 400 pounds of copper boiler fittings, stolen right from under the noses of 22 employees, all during the workday. The fittings were stored in a maintenance alcove adjacent to the building's lower-level steam tunnels. Only a few people had regular access to that room, and all of them were trusted. But the fittings didn't vanish in silence. A janitor, Julius Meeks, recalled hearing a strange clanging noise around 2:15 that afternoon. He assumed it was a misloaded cart laundry tumbling in wire bins, a normal enough sound. But as the day drew on and the room was later inspected for a routine repair, the fittings were gone, gone without a trace. No forced locks, no pried windows, just a cold, empty space where they once lay. A quiet crime in a loud place. Detective Bernard J. Tulliver, a short, fastidious man with the look of a high school Latin teacher, was brought in from the Scranton office to investigate. He'd made his name solving a string of thefts involving stolen heating coils from locomotive yards in 1909. The first thing Tulliver noted was the complete absence of struggle or entry. If the copper was taken, he wrote in his initial report, it was taken with the laundry, not apart from it. That single sentence would define the rest of the investigation. Elm Street's process was clockwork. Laundry was brought in by morning, sorted by noon, washed, boiled, and pressed by afternoon. Everything left in covered baskets or canvas carts. If someone wanted to smuggle out copper parts, each weighing nearly 10–15 pounds, they'd have had to do it slowly, methodically, and disguised as something utterly ordinary. Like a pile of damp linens. The suspect list. At first, suspicion turned to outsiders. Scrap thieves were common in that era, especially when metal prices jumped. But no signs of forced entry ruled that out. The investigation narrowed to internal suspects, employees who worked near the tunnels. Among them were Arnold Becker, the boilerman. He'd been with the laundry for 12 years. Quiet, punctual, owned a small house just south of the facility. Edna Riggins, a floor supervisor known for her strictness. Leon Slats Maloney, a delivery cart driver with a reputation for gambling debts and a side hustle collecting discarded metal for resale. Tulliver interviewed them each. Becker swore he hadn't entered the alcove all day. Riggins barely acknowledged the room existed. Maloney, however, seemed nervous. He claimed he only entered the lower floors to load carts, but his time cards showed he clocked in and out with almost surgical precision, never staying longer than a few minutes. Still, no direct evidence surfaced. The laundry basket angle. The real break in the case came when Tulliver began inspecting old laundry carts, particularly those marked for the St. Mary's Hospital account, which had their own unique labeling system. In one such cart, stashed at the far end of the delivery room, Tulliver found a small trail of black grease, similar to that used on boiler machinery. But it wasn't the grease that made him pause. It was what lay beneath the false bottom of the cart, two brass wingnuts, unpolished and unwashed. Suddenly, the theory wasn't so far-fetched. Someone had modified one or more carts to carry copper hidden beneath the linens and done so without anyone noticing. One cart at a time, day by day. If the timeline held, this heist wasn't a singular act. It was slow, deliberate theft over a period of at least a month. The economics of scrap. In 1911, copper sold for around 12–13 cents a pound, a not insignificant sum. With over 400 pounds missing, the yield would have been close to $50, equivalent to more than $1,500 today. Enough to settle debts, enough to disappear. Local scrapyards were visited. Most managers claimed to keep solid records, but receipts were handwritten, spotty, and rarely identified sellers beyond vague initials. One receipt stood out, a sale made by someone listed as S. Mal, for 186 pounds of mixed copper scrap. No address. Just the date, March 22, 2 weeks before the theft was discovered. Tulliver's hunch, S. Mal was Slats Maloney. But proving it would require something more tangible. A city that didn't notice. In the broader scope of early 20th century crime, the Laundry Basket Heist was barely a whisper. Newspapers mentioned it once on page 6 of the Wilkes-Barre Times Leader, beneath a blurb about a missing cat. No headlines, no public outrage, just a quiet question among those who worked there. How could someone rob a place like this without anyone seeing a thing? There was no formal arrest, no trial, just speculation, and a lingering uncertainty that someone among them, someone ordinary, had managed to pull off an inside job, slow as steam and just as quiet. As the spring days lengthened and the town's attention turned toward the coming industrial fair, the case slowly evaporated from public thought. But Tulliver didn't forget, nor did the few who worked those boiler rooms. Because something about that theft, it wasn't about the money. It was about the method. Someone had outsmarted the very system they were part of. But who? And how deep did the plan go? There's something unsettling about a crime committed slowly. It doesn't storm in like a masked bandit. It doesn't shriek across town with sirens or stir fear in neighborhoods. It waits. It weaves. It blends into daily routines until one day it simply is, like the missing copper at the Elm Street Laundry. Detective Bernard Tulliver had come to understand this. This case didn't stink of rage or desperation. It didn't bear the marks of chaos. This was patience applied criminally. But the trail was cooling. Until, of course, he opened the wrong closet. Behind the boiler door. On April 17th, 8 days after the theft was reported, Tulliver returned to Elm Street alone. He asked to see the basement again without escort. The foreman, half distracted with payroll, waved him down the steps. The laundry's underbelly was labyrinthine. Brick corridors, stacked crates, old carts, pipes overhead hissing with leftover heat from the day's work. And then near the back wall, a locked boiler closet. Oddly, it wasn't on the blueprints. Tulliver pressed his ear to the door. Nothing. He pried it open with a small folding pick from his coat. Inside, spare parts, toolboxes, cleaning supplies, and a long gray coat. It was too clean, pressed, folded on a low stool. In the pocket, a folded metal cart axle pin wrapped in a strip of cotton cloth. It wasn't evidence of theft, not exactly, but it was a start. Following the fabric, that cotton cloth turned out to be the key. Standard Elm Street laundry cloth bore a small, stamped pattern unique to each account. This one matched linen from Foster and Gaines Hotel, a downtown establishment that recently moved their linen servicing from Elm Street to another vendor just a week before the heist was discovered. Why the chain? Tulliver visited the hotel. The manager, a gentleman named Clarence Vaught, told him the hotel had suffered a series of linen losses. Nothing huge but noticeable, pillowcases disappearing, bedsheets returned stained or smelling odd, complaints from guests. Elm Street was never accused directly, but the damage to reputation was enough. Vaught showed Tulliver a record of the switch, March 31st, just before the final missing copper fittings were noticed. So the question formed, was the Foster and Gaines linen account used as a cover for copper theft? And if so, why the sabotage? Maloney's mounting motive. Maloney's name came up again, and not just in the scrapyard receipt. A former hotel employee recalled a driver short, balding, always humming, who often lingered at the service entrance longer than necessary. Smelled like tobacco and machine oil. When shown a photo of Maloney, the man confirmed it. That's him. That's the laundry guy who flirted with my cousin and bummed cigarettes. Maloney denied it all when re-questioned. No sir, I ain't never handled hotel laundry. Just hospital linens and some rail accounts. Don't even know where the Foster and Gaines is. But payroll logs told a different story. For 3 weeks in March, his morning routes were altered slightly. Enough to suggest he was servicing the Foster and Gaines account under Edna Riggins' watch. So why lie? Tulliver suspected this wasn't just a theft. It was a scam, orchestrated from within the laundry's own management. The real laundering. Further digging into laundry operations revealed something strange. Misaligned inventory logs. Sheets counted in but not counted out. A drop in steam pressure readings in the boiler room suggesting unauthorized equipment use. Then came the big one. A maintenance requisition from March 7th, filed under Becker's name, approved by Riggins, ordering 2 spare boiler feed valves and a copper expansion coil. Parts that were never installed. They weren't needed. Tulliver pieced together the following. Spare copper was being ordered under the guise of repairs. Parts were then quietly stored in the basement alcove. Modified carts, possibly with false bottoms, were used to remove them. Maloney drove them out under legitimate deliveries. The Foster and Gaines linens may have hidden the scrap until they noticed something was off. And overseeing it, likely Edna Riggins, the floor supervisor with control over delivery schedules, part orders, and cart routing. But none of it was enough for an arrest. Tulliver needed someone to break. The night watchman's ledger. Salvation came from an unlikely source. On a hunch, Tulliver visited the Harrow salvage yard, a less regulated scrapyard on the outskirts of town. He spoke with the night watchman, Ezra Birdie Wilkes, a wiry man with a bad limp and better memory. Birdie had a notebook. Just names I like to keep, in case someone thinks I done stole something. Among the scrawled entries, Mar 3 S. Malley 58 lb, copper bits. Mar 9 S. Malley 72 lb, more scrap. Mar 22 S. Malley 186 lb, total, paid full. Tulliver stared at the pages. One more name caught his eye. Feb 28 E. Rig 32 lb, flat copper/wire. Rig, not Riggins, but close. Was Edna involved directly in offloading scrap? Birdie shrugged. Could have been her. Tall lady, real stiff, didn't say much. The pieces clicked into place. The arrest that never was. In late April, Tulliver presented his findings to the city prosecutor. The trail of paper, altered routes, cart modifications, and eyewitness accounts formed a compelling narrative but lacked a direct witness or physical proof tying Maloney or Riggins to the sale. Both were questioned. Both denied involvement. Maloney claimed the scrapyard receipts weren't his. That ain't my handwriting. Riggins refused to answer anything but the basics. I run a clean floor, that's all I'll say. Becker, for his part, wept when questioned. I signed the part orders, cause Edna told me to. I didn't think anything of it. She said it was just spare inventory in case of breakdown. Ultimately, no charges were filed. The laundry installed locks on all lower floor access points. Cart inspections became mandatory. Both Maloney and Riggins resigned quietly in May. Riggins moved to Ohio. Maloney vanished from town. Becker stayed but never looked the same. The case file was closed without conclusion. The cost of silence. Despite the lack of formal charges, the Elm Street Laundry's reputation suffered. Accounts like Foster and Gaines never returned. The company limped along for 2 more years before being absorbed by a larger textile firm. Its name, like the heist, faded from memory. For Tulliver, the case remained one of the most frustrating of his career. In a private letter written in 1920, he reflected on the incident. It was the sort of crime that mocks you, not by its scale but by its simplicity. You know who did it, you understand how. But without that one slip, without the foolish brag or careless receipt, it just slips through your fingers like hot water through steam. The psychology of a quiet crime. What drives someone to steal slowly? Historians later studying the case considered it a rare example of what would now be called a low-pressure heist, a scheme that doesn't rely on dramatic risk, but rather on systematic erosion of trust and oversight. There was no violence, no breaking of locks. The heist succeeded because it didn't look like one. The Laundry Basket Heist of 1911 wasn't famous. It wasn't covered in dime store novels. But in crime archives, it holds a strange little space, a case of internal subversion, a quiet crime in a loud world. And it all unfolded beneath the hiss of a boiler and the fold of clean sheets. But there's still one question Tulliver never answered. Who helped them build the false-bottomed carts? Because someone did. And that someone was never identified. It would have been easy to let the case die right there, no arrests, no trial, just a fatting folder in the back of a metal cabinet. But Detective Bernard Tulliver didn't work like that. He didn't chase criminals for applause. He chased completeness. And while Riggins, Maloney, and Becker had all slipped through the cracks with carefully measured lies, there remained a single unanswered question. Who built the carts? Who had the skill, the tools, and the access to modify laundry carts' heavy wooden frames reinforced with wire mesh and iron wheels into containers capable of smuggling nearly 400 pounds of copper beneath linen? It was Becker, it wasn't Riggins, and Tulliver was certain it was Maloney. Slats had a gift for deceit and logistics, sure, but he couldn't tighten a bolt without cutting his hand. Someone else had to be involved. And it had to be someone overlooked. The forgotten man. The breakthrough came in the form of a time-worn maintenance log, uncovered by chance in a secondary supply closet on the second floor. A crumbling red ledger, its pages yellowed with starch and years of neglect. On March 2, 1911, just days before the suspected heist began, a man named Wilbur Claude Fenley signed in for a short-term weld and repair contract. Duration, 10 days. Purpose, wheel stabilization and cart reinforcement. No one had mentioned Fenley during the investigation. Tulliver checked employment records, no file existed. He asked around. A few older employees vaguely recalled a man who worked in the basement, but only for a week or two. One referred to him as the cart tinker. Another said he didn't talk much, had funny hands, burn marks. It made sense. He hadn't been hired by the laundry. He'd been brought in temporarily by Riggins under the guise of reinforcing older carts. But those carts didn't need repair. They needed conversion. A visit to Hanover Street. Tulliver began digging for Fenley's whereabouts, starting with local welders' unions. Nothing. Blacksmith guilds. No listings. He checked the city work rolls, finally locating a Wilbur C. Fenley, formerly a rail yard mechanic for the Wilkes-Barre and Eastern Line. Dismissed in 1909 for unapproved alterations to rolling stock equipment. Further inquiry revealed that Fenley had once been fined for building an unauthorized undercarriage modification meant to hide tools beneath rail cars. A clever idea, but against company policy. After his dismissal, Fenley disappeared from the public employment records. Until it seemed, Edna Riggins hired him off the books. The locksmith's note. One of the final pieces in this quiet puzzle came from Lamb's Hardware and Locksmith, where a peculiar order was logged in late February 1911. A customer named W.C. Fenley purchased a barrel of number 3 rivets, 2 sets of recessed lock hinges, 1 pound of paraffin grease, 4 flat steel panels, pre-cut to cart dimensions. Lamb remembered him. Burned-up gloves, smelled like turpentine and starch, asked too many questions about axle balance. The store was a 10-minute walk from Elm Street Laundry. The price of skill. Why would Fenley do it? That's what Tulliver asked himself again and again. The man wasn't dumb. He knew the risks. And yet, when offered the opportunity to outfit several laundry carts with false bottoms, hinged access panels, and noise-dampening materials, he said yes. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was the satisfaction of applying an obscure skill to a practical task. Or maybe, like so many quiet criminals, Fenley simply liked the feeling of being invisible. He had no family listed, no criminal record outside his firing. He was a ghost in the city. And after April 1911, he disappeared completely. The silent collapse. Without a living witness or physical confession, Tulliver couldn't close the case with certainty. The DA wouldn't touch it. Neither would the newspapers, already enthralled by a speakeasy bust in nearby Pittston. But internally, among law enforcement and the remnants of the Elm Street Laundry staff, there was quiet consensus. Riggins ran the operation. Maloney was the transporter. Becker, knowingly or not, helped supply the copper. And Wilbur Claude, Fenley built the system that made it possible. Together, they executed a crime so subtle, so boring, and so brilliantly procedural that it nearly vanished beneath the folds of washed linen. A whisper in the archives. By 1934, Elm Street Laundry had been repurposed into an auto parts warehouse. A small placard in its entryway noted its former history as a commercial laundry. No mention of the heist, no public record of the lost copper. But in a private letter from Tulliver to a young detective in Scranton dated 1937, the elder investigator offered some parting advice. Sometimes, it's not the criminal with the biggest knife or the loudest gunshot you need to fear. It's the one with the quiet cart. The one who takes one bolt at a time. Because by the time you notice, they're already gone. And the room's still clean. The legacy of the laundry heist. In the years that followed, police departments across Pennsylvania began implementing more thorough vendor vetting procedures. Short-term contractors, especially in manufacturing or service industries, were subjected to deeper background checks. Cart inspection standards changed, too. Hospitals and hotels adopted new security protocols for items entering or exiting facilities, including random cart disassembly. Fenley was never found. Riggins was reportedly seen in Akron, Ohio in 1915, working as a linen manager for a sanatorium. Maloney's trail ended in Baltimore. Rumors of his death in a dockyard brawl were never confirmed. Becker lived until 1946, passing quietly in Wilkes-Barre. None of them ever spoke publicly about the crime. None of them ever saw punishment. But their story, their slow, deliberate heist, remains one of the most quietly audacious thefts of the early 20th century. And in the end, the most astonishing thing about the Laundry Basket Heist of 1911 isn't that it happened. It's that it worked. You might think the end of a war would bring an end to wartime crime. But sometimes, the tail end of a conflict leaves behind just enough chaos, infrastructure, and institutional leftovers for something quieter and stranger to creep in. That's what happened in 1947 in the sleepy industrial city of Decatur, Illinois. At the time, it was still adjusting to peacetime footing. The war had ended almost 2 years earlier, but thousands of federal contracts lingered, many tied to Army supply depots and regional logistics hubs. One of the busiest, Camp Riley Distribution Annex, a sprawling 62-acre facility that had once been the main ration supply center for the Midwestern theater. And at the center of the facility, stacked in rows and rows, were canteens, hundreds of thousands of stamped aluminum containers, some used, most never issued. It was among these that a strange and drawn-out fraud took root, one that involved fake military records, unauthorized sales, and a black market for Army surplus so mundane, you could almost sleep through it. The quiet rise of ration surplus. In the immediate aftermath of WWII, the United States government faced a logistical nightmare. It had overproduced almost 4 million tons of surplus supplies, including food, medical gear, uniforms, and basic utility goods like mess kits and water canteens. The government's solution was a hastily assembled agency known as the War Assets Administration, WAA, tasked with liquidating surplus property to civilians, contractors, and local municipalities. Camp Riley became one of their major sites. By early 1947, the depot was preparing for large-scale liquidation. Bidders, contractors, and private parties could request crates of items for auction, including the now obsolete M1910 aluminum canteens, which had once cost the government 38 cents apiece to manufacture. This is where Charles Chick Dobbins came in. Chick Dobbins, quartermaster turned opportunist. Dobbins was a mid-level civilian contractor who'd once worked as a quartermaster liaison during the war, helping coordinate the movement of rations and supplies from Midwestern depots to coastal embarkation zones. He was organized, punctual, and invisible, exactly the sort of man who could make a system work without calling attention to himself. After the war, Dobbins stayed in Decatur, picking up temporary clerical work at the Camp Riley Annex under the WAA. According to payroll logs, his title was Surplus Inventory Adjustment Clerk, a job that meant little to the average person, but one that granted broad access to storage manifests, pallet records, and transportation forms. No one paid much attention to what Chick Dobbins was doing. Not until he started submitting duplicate requests for shipments that had already left the yard. The first red flag, the Bloomington mix-up. In March 1947, a minor error was flagged during a routine audit in Bloomington, 45 miles northeast of Decatur. A local hardware supply chain had received 6 crates of M1910 canteens, but had paperwork for only 3. No one thought much of it. The hardware store's owner, Russell Ames, said he bought them off a federal clearance intermediary named Dobbins Supplies and Transfer, a small LLC based in Decatur. This was odd because Dobbins Supplies and Transfer wasn't a registered surplus resale partner. In fact, the name didn't appear on any of the WAA's authorized liquidation agent lists. A call was placed to Camp Riley. The logs showed a discrepancy. The crate numbers matched the ones already shipped to another buyer, a veteran co-op in Peoria. 2 buyers, 1 set of canteens. Someone had forged a second bill of lading. That someone was likely Chick Dobbins. The blueprint for quiet fraud. A deeper review of outgoing forms at Camp Riley began to show a subtle pattern. Each shipment approved by Dobbins included 1 or 2 pallets of low-value items, canteens, shovel heads, mess trays. Nothing large enough to trigger immediate suspicion. But what they all had in common was this: a separate hand-typed bill of lading, a reference number that trailed 1 digit off from legitimate ones. The same courier, a local freight company called Eagle Line Haulers. And every single shipment was being routed to unlisted third-party buyers in small-town hardware stores, feed co-ops, or veterans groups, none of which had properly registered WAA purchase orders. Dobbins was essentially creating a ghost surplus sales pipeline, using legitimate stock, altered paperwork, and the full infrastructure of the Camp Riley depot. By the time any of it was discovered, the goods were already gone. How it worked: a mundane heist. The genius of the scam was in its simplicity. Identify slow-moving inventory. Dobbins focused on canteens because they were durable, nondescript, and difficult to track in large batches. He chose items that no one at headquarters was actively monitoring. Create a forged request. Using carbon paper and spare forms, he would make a duplicate shipping order slightly modified from a legitimate one filed days earlier. Arrange private pickup. He used Eagle Line haulers, a small freight service that likely didn't know it was participating in a crime. They'd receive an official-looking bill of lading and deliver to whoever Dobbins instructed. Sell at a discount. Dobbins then sold the canteens to third parties at below-market rates, often cash, occasionally barter, and pocketed the difference. Each batch was worth maybe $100, $200 in profit. But over 5 months, Dobbins processed nearly 1,100 crates, amounting to close to $24,000 in untracked goods, more than $300,000 today. All without a single break-in, no violence, no missing guards. Just fake paperwork, trusted routine, and a system bloated with bureaucracy. A faint paper trail. The investigation into the misdirected canteens was initially slow. Surplus fraud was rampant in 1947. Hundreds of small-time dealers exploited post-war confusion to make a buck. The government was overwhelmed and under-resourced. But in May, a second whistleblower emerged. Her name was Elsa Raleigh, a temporary transcriptionist working part-time at Camp Riley. She noticed something odd. Several of Dobbins' shipment logs had correction tape on the dates, but the original typing could still be seen when held to light. It looked like he was changing the day by 1 or 2 digits, as if backdating them just slightly, she later told investigators. Elsa brought the forms to a regional auditor. And just like that, the entire scheme began to unravel. Dobbins confronted. In June 1947, Chick Dobbins was called in for a routine review of surplus processing logs. By then, internal auditors had already identified 26 duplicate shipments. They expected a confession or at least resistance. Instead, Dobbins offered an explanation so mundane, it felt believable. I was correcting errors. There were just so many crates, and sometimes the numbers didn't match. I thought it was easier to make new forms than send the old ones back up the chain. When pressed, he fumbled, said he didn't recall specific buyers, couldn't produce invoices, claimed some records were probably burned during a form cleanout. Eventually, Dobbins was suspended but not arrested. Not yet, because the question still lingered. Where had all those canteens gone? And perhaps more importantly, was Dobbins really acting alone? If Chick Dobbins had stolen diamonds, rare art, or bank bonds, the investigation might have drawn national attention. But what he stole was canteens, and not even rare ones. The M1910 aluminum canteen was a humble item, rounded, dull gray, with a screw top and a slightly dented feel from years of mass production. Millions were made, few were valued, and most were forgotten. That's exactly what made them perfect. But as the investigators would learn, Dobbins wasn't just pilfering rations. He was plugging into a quiet, sprawling network, one built from the remains of wartime logistics, fed by apathy, and shielded by the kind of everyday mundanity that doesn't make headlines. The small-town resellers. The initial audit uncovered 26 fraudulent shipment logs. A more thorough dig, led by a team from the War Assets Administration's Internal Fraud Division, pushed the number up to 82. These were traced to 17 different delivery addresses, scattered across Illinois, Missouri, and Indiana. They included hardware and feed supply stores in Effingham, Terre Haute, and Quincy, 2 small-town American Legion posts, a roadside army surplus dealer near Joliet, a defunct warehouse near Vandalia used for storage. Interviews with store owners painted a curious picture. Nearly all claimed they had purchased the canteens legally, sometimes with a receipt, sometimes not. Most remembered the seller only vaguely. Guy in a brown coat, wore a Camp Riley badge, said the stuff was cleared inventory. Some had paid cash. Others traded in goods, old farm equipment, wood stoves, even a batch of boot soles. None of them knew the items were illegally diverted federal property. And most couldn't or wouldn't say whether they knew the man's name was Chick Dobbins. The Eagle Line link. Investigators turned their attention to Eagle Line haulers, the small freight company that had delivered nearly 90% of the suspect's shipments. Run by a former military driver named Roland "Buck" Selby, the company operated 4 trucks, each leased to independent contractors. Their routes were irregular, their books barely organized. Selby swore he knew nothing of the scam. "We get a form, we haul the load, we don't ask questions. If it's stamped and signed, we roll." And the forms were stamped using a forged rubber WAA seal Dobbins had apparently made using a local engraving service. Investigators found 2 such stamps in Dobbins' rented storage unit. Selby's drivers, too, claimed ignorance. One remembered Dobbins distinctly. "He was always calm, had that government tone, not the kind that says much, gave us cash tips sometimes." But there was no evidence Eagle Line profited knowingly. Their cooperation likely saved them from prosecution. The book nobody noticed. Back at Camp Riley, a final piece of evidence surfaced in Dobbins' former office, a narrow spiral-bound notebook tucked into the underside of a desk drawer. Inside were scribbled entries, mostly numbers and initials, but toward the middle were full names. T. Weldon, Vandalia, 24 crates, paid $310. Legion Hall, QH, 12 crates mess kits, 6 canteens. JS/Jan, 8 crates, Jasper Co-op. CN 3X monthly drop, no record. What stood out most, however, were the names with asterisks beside them, 5 total. 3 of those names belonged to Camp Riley employees. The scheme, it turned out, was not a one-man operation. The web expands. By late July 1947, the WAA Fraud Division had quietly assembled a profile of a small but coordinated group of insiders, all of whom had worked at the depot in some capacity. They included Clifford Null, a supply foreman with key access to outbound loading zones; Gene Tilley, a typist who handled duplicate manifest paperwork; Roger "Red" Maddox, a mechanic responsible for maintenance of the depot's forklifts and hand trucks. None of them had criminal records. All were part of the war effort, either through civilian support or demobilization contracts. And yet each had motive. Null had recently paid off a mortgage on a salary that shouldn't have allowed it. Tilley's sister owned a hardware store in Vincennes that had mysteriously acquired bulk Army goods. Maddox was caught modifying a forklift's lift record, marking a load as damaged, when it had actually been quietly transferred. Dobbins, it appeared, had built a soft conspiracy, not through coercion but through mutual benefit, tiny bribes, shared profits, gentle persuasion wrapped in routine. The scheme wasn't bold, it was comfortable. That made it more dangerous. The arrest nobody cheered. On August 2, 1947, federal agents arrested Charles "Chick" Dobbins at his boarding house on Marigold Avenue. The local paper didn't bother running a front-page story. It made page 5, below a piece on prized tomatoes. He was charged with theft of government property, forgery of official documents, conspiracy to defraud a federal agency. The maximum sentence was 15 years. He pled guilty to 2 charges, denied conspiracy, and most notably refused to name any co-conspirators. He received a sentence of 5 years, later reduced to 3 for cooperation during trial preparation. The others, Null, Tilly, and Maddox, were quietly dismissed but never charged. The government, already drowning in fraud cases, chose to move on. What was never proven. Several investigators believed the operation had additional layers, potentially including off-the-books buyers in Chicago and St. Louis, where Army surplus resale had become a booming black market business. One crate, originally meant for Camp Riley, turned up in a pawn shop in Kansas City. Another batch marked with duplicate labels was spotted months later in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. But the paper trail went cold. Too many forms, too few witnesses. As surplus inventory dried up in 1948, so too did the opportunities for such crimes. But the lessons lingered. A system built for loopholes. The counterfeit canteen capers of 1947 didn't involve grand shootouts or high-stakes cons. It didn't shock the public. It didn't change laws. But it did shine a soft light on something quietly corrosive. The ease with which a single person can manipulate a bloated system built for speed, not scrutiny. In the wake of the Dobbins case, WAA implemented a revised shipment tracking system, introducing carbon-stamped receipts, mandatory secondary verification signatures, and tighter controls on surplus transfer requests. But for every tightened screw, there were still corners left open. And even as Dobbins served his sentence in a low-security prison outside Springfield, a question continued to surface in internal memos and investigator notebooks. How many other Dobbins were out there? The federal government called it a logistical discrepancy. The newspapers called it a surplus scandal. But for those who understood how post-war America actually operated, those who'd moved goods by train and truck, filed paperwork in warehouses, and sold equipment from wooden crates by the road, the counterfeit canteen capers were something else entirely. A sleeper heist, executed not with speed or violence, but with calm clerical precision. As Charles Chick Dobbins began his prison sentence in late 1947, he left behind not just a paper trail, but a growing suspicion that his scam was not unique. It was a template one that others were likely already using. The echoes of Dobbins. By the end of 1948, investigators from the War Assets Administration had linked 4 more surplus cases with strikingly similar characteristics. In Pocatello, Idaho, a surplus depot reported missing field gear that reappeared for sale in Oregon hardware stores. In Jacksonville, Florida, a shipment of mess kits went to a veterans group that had never filed a request, but the paperwork bore a perfect seal. In Akron, Ohio, over 1,200 gas mask filters were listed as destroyed inventory, but turned up in police auctions months later. Each case followed the same rhythm. Legitimate stock diverted through minor paperwork alterations. False manifests created using near-identical forms. Small-town buyers given what appeared to be federal clearance. Investigators referred to these as Dobbin-style cases. The term stuck in government memos well into the early 1950s. What happened to the canteens? Of the estimated 110,000 canteens that were diverted by Dobbins and his informal ring, fewer than 8,000 were ever recovered. Some ended up in second-hand military stores, especially popular as Boy Scout gear or camping supplies. Others were melted down and sold for aluminum scrap, providing quick cash for small businesses or black market recyclers. And some simply vanished stored in barns, cellars, or forgotten shipping crates in towns where no one asked too many questions. By 1950, there were more military surplus items in civilian hands than in federal depots. The government chalked it up to the cost of demobilization. Dobbins' life after prison. Chick Dobbins was released in 1950, having served just under 3 years of his 5-year sentence. He returned not to Decatur but to Toledo, Ohio, where he lived under the radar, working in clerical roles. No charges were ever filed against him again. In a rare 1965 interview, granted anonymously to a Midwestern history researcher, he reflected on the scam. "People think crime is about what you take. It's not. It's about whether anyone notices it missing. I didn't steal because I needed money. I stole because I knew the system would let me." His words weren't proud. They weren't even bitter. They were dispassionate, the way you might explain how to balance an accounting book or build a shipping schedule. Gene Tilley and the others. Unlike Dobbins, the 3 other suspected collaborators, Clifford Null, Gene Tilley, and Roger Red, Maddox, faced no prison time. Null disappeared from public records after 1948. Some believed he moved to Oklahoma. Others thought he opened a salvage yard in Iowa under a different name. Gene Tilley, the typist, relocated to Kansas City and worked as a secretary for a wholesale tools company. Her name surfaced again briefly in a 1952 surplus audit, but no charges were ever filed. Maddox died in 1951, reportedly from a ruptured appendix. His estate included 4 large crates of unsold military gear, which were quietly confiscated by federal agents. In the end, none of the co-conspirators ever publicly admitted their role, and no one outside the agency seemed to care. Lessons in the leftovers. The story of the canteen fraud quietly influenced future legislation. As the Korean War began in 1950, the U.S. government implemented new surplus controls. Shipment forms required multi-point authentication, including embossed seals and notarized clearance. Randomized inventory audits were introduced at all regional depots. Civilian access to military gear was tightened, requiring background checks for large-scale purchases. But for years afterward, veterans and collectors could still find Dobbins-era canteens in flea markets, attics, and hardware shops. They were artifacts not just of war, but of bureaucracy's soft underbelly. The hidden toll. What makes the counterfeit canteen capers so curious isn't the money, though $300,000 in adjusted losses is nothing to scoff at. It's that no one noticed. Not when it started, not when it grew, not even when it spread. These were thefts built on dullness, protected by the assumption that low-value items aren't worth watching. But they were, because they taught investigators, for the first time, that theft doesn't always involve violence or spectacle. Sometimes it's the man with the clipboard, walking through a depot at dusk, the typist who switches 2 numbers, the freight driver who just follows instructions, and the buyer who doesn't ask too many questions. The war ended in 1945, but the surplus didn't. And in the silence that followed, a different kind of operation began. One canteen at a time. There's a comfort to the postal system. It runs on regularity, routes repeated daily, uniforms that never change, packages delivered with quiet certainty. For decades, the U.S. Postal Service was one of the most trusted institutions in the country. Rain, snow, sleet, or shine. So when something disappeared inside that system, it wasn't just a loss. It was a disturbance in the very rhythm of daily life. In the winter of 1963, the town of Kenton, Ohio, noticed such a disturbance. It started not with a missing parcel or a stolen letter, but with something far more abstract: math that didn't make sense. The story that followed would expose a slow, calculated scheme of fraud conducted over nearly a year, hidden inside balance sheets, paper ledgers, and routine accounting logs. No one broke in. No one pulled a gun. No one even raised their voice. They simply moved numbers and waited. A town that ran on the clock. Kenton was a town of about 9,000 people in 1963, small, polite, and built on routine. Its downtown was lined with hardware stores, diners, and a proud red brick post office that stood like a fortress on West Franklin Street. Postmaster Arnold L. Beasley had held the position for nearly 12 years. Known for his punctuality, Beasley had built a reputation for running one of the most efficient branches in the state. Mail left on time. Staff kept neat logs. Audits came and went without note. So when Revenue Ledger 6A for the fiscal year showed a $312 discrepancy, Beasley took it personally. That kind of error didn't happen under his watch. He triple-checked the math, still wrong. He asked Margaret Darnell, the station clerk, to review the parcel fees, still short. The number kept showing up $312.14, missing from recorded stamp sales for October 1962. A small amount in federal terms. But Beasley knew something didn't add up. And in a system built entirely on trust, even a small missing number could unravel something much larger. The anatomy of postal accounting. In the 1960s, before computer systems fully took hold, local post offices maintained handwritten ledgers for nearly every transaction. Incoming postage stamp shipments, money order sales and redemptions, parcel postage transactions, registered and insured mail fees, cash deposits made to local bank branches. Each ledger had a carbon copy, which was mailed to the regional accounting center monthly. The originals stayed in the office filed and cross-checked in case of disputes or audits. The system worked because every number appeared twice, once on site, once in the federal books. Unless, of course, someone figured out how to switch the copies. The carbon paper game. Beasley's first real clue came during a cold Tuesday in January 1963, when he noticed something odd about the ledger paper itself. The ink on the October Register Ledger 6A was slightly faded, as though written with a lighter hand than usual. The carbon imprint on the office copy was bold, but the sent copy was faint. He retrieved a second ledger, this time for registered parcel transactions. The ink looked different. Then another. Then another. Beasley began stacking them side by side. For 5 months, the carbon intensity between local copies and submitted ledgers had flipped. In some cases, the local carbon copy looked like the original. In others, the original looked like a copy that had been rewritten. His conclusion: someone had been replacing ledger pages before they were mailed to the regional office. Enter the inspector. By mid-February, Beasley had seen enough. Quietly, and without notifying his full staff, he placed a call to the Postal Inspection Service, specifically to Inspector Richard R. Cooley, based in Cincinnati. Cooley was known in his field as the tortoise, not for slowness, but for his methodical, persistent pace. He never rushed. He never bluffed. He just kept asking the same questions over and over until inconsistencies revealed themselves. On February 19th, Cooley arrived in Kenton posing as a visiting auditor from the Regional Supply Division. He began reviewing the past 9 months of transaction ledgers, comparing office records to those submitted. What he found was troubling. 6 separate ledgers had non-matching entries between the office copy and regional records. Bank deposit slips for certain months were missing completely. And most notably, the money order ledger for August 1962 was a different shade of paper stock than all the others, suggesting it had been replaced from a different supply batch. All of this pointed to intentional tampering. But the question was who? And more importantly, why? The inside opportunity. The Kenton Post Office had 9 employees. Of those, 3 had direct access to the accounting files. Margaret Darnell, lead station clerk with 19 years of service. William Billy Haskins, a young postal assistant just hired in 1961. Alma Brinks, the part-time deposit runner, responsible for carrying sealed envelopes to the local First National Bank branch twice a week. Inspector Cooley began quiet interviews. Darnell seemed flustered but cooperative. She blamed the discrepancies on paper shrinkage and ink inconsistency, unlikely but not impossible. Haskins claimed he rarely touched the ledgers and only filled in parcel forms when others were absent. Brinks, however, raised a flag. She admitted she often ran errands unsupervised, including bank runs and post-box pickups. She also kept a metal cash box in her desk drawer for overage reconciliations, she said. When asked to open the box, she hesitated. Inside was $174.63 in loose cash, none of it marked or labeled. It wasn't proof of theft, but it wasn't procedure either. A test of trust. Inspector Cooley hatched a plan. He inserted a decoy ledger page, containing a deliberate $10 error, into the next month's outgoing reports. He marked the carbon with a traceable pencil additive, a material that would leave residue under ultraviolet light if tampered with. 3 days later, the carbon copy returned from the Kenton office. The error was gone. And under UV light, the residue was smudged. Someone had removed and replaced the page. It was proof of swap. Cooley now knew for certain. Someone was intercepting ledgers between the time they were signed and mailed. And the swap was deliberate, precise, and likely happening inside the office. A pattern in the pages. Over the next week, Cooley reviewed 2 years' worth of ledger data. The fraud had begun: small rounding errors, unclaimed money order fees, underrecorded stamp sales. Each month the difference grew. By July 1962, monthly skims reached $400 or more, always tucked beneath the layers of routine. It wasn't a massive theft, but it was chronic and intentional. And just when Cooley felt close to nomming a suspect, something happened that caught even him by surprise. Margaret Darnell requested an emergency transfer effective immediately. When Margaret Darnell requested her emergency transfer on March 3, 1963, she cited family health issues as her reason. But Inspector Richard Cooley had heard excuses before. Margaret had spent nearly 2 decades at the Kenton Post Office without a single disciplinary mark, her sudden exit coinciding precisely with the discovery of ledger swaps smelled like more than coincidence. Cooley suspected she wasn't just leaving to avoid suspicion. He believed she had been orchestrating the entire scheme. The quiet art of ledger swapping. As Cooley dug deeper, he began to piece together the exact mechanism of the fraud: a slow, repetitive act of minor deception, executed with clerical elegance. Hear how the scheme worked. At the end of each week, the post office's primary ledger stamps, parcel fees, and money order sales were handwritten and signed by Margaret Darnell. These ledgers had 2 copies. The original, to be mailed to the regional accounting office in Columbus. The carbon copy, to be stored locally in the Kenton branch's ledger drawer. Before mailing, Darnell would retrieve the original from the outbox and quietly swap 1 or more pages with modified versions that underreported transactions, typically shaving off $20 to $60 per line item. The difference between the true totals stored only in the carbon copy and the fraudulent originals would then appear missing only in Columbus. Locally, the math still added up. Once the fraudulent report was submitted, she would pocket the cash difference, which had already been collected by the branch but was no longer tied to a line item. By the time Beasley discovered the discrepancy in January, Darnell had already skimmed nearly $2,800 in untraceable funds. And no one, not the postmaster, not the regional accounting office, had noticed. The missing slips affair. The investigation might have hit a wall if not for a misfiled envelope discovered in an unused cabinet drawer. Inside was a stack of bank deposit slips, the yellow originals from August to October 1962, all marked with handwritten initials, M.D. Beasley, meticulous as ever, remembered that the final bank balances recorded for those months didn't match the sums on these slips. He cross-checked them again. There it was, a shortfall of $132.50 between the physical slips and the ledger totals sent to Columbus. Each slip had been signed and sealed, but the sums had been altered on the federal reports. Cooley now had a paper trail, not solid enough for prosecution, but enough to keep Darnell from leaving easily. He filed a temporary hold on her transfer paperwork, citing pending internal audit issues. A carefully worded confrontation. Cooley confronted Margaret on March 5th, not with direct accusations, but with patterns. "Margaret," he said, "you've worked here 19 years. You know every corner of this office. Why is it the carbon copy for September's stamp revenue shows $648, but Columbus only received a report for $594? She said nothing. He tried again. "I found deposit slips with your initials. They don't match the ledgers you signed. I'd like to hear your side of that." Her reply was quiet, calculated. "I'm sure there's an explanation. I'd like to speak with a union rep." And with that, the door closed. The handwriting sample. Later that week, Cooley received a note from the regional office. A mail fraud case in Zanesville, Ohio, had revealed altered ledgers from a former employee, one who had trained under Margaret Darnell in 1958. The connection was slim but troubling. Cooley obtained samples of Darnell's handwriting and matched them against altered line entries in multiple Kenton ledger pages. The slant, the loop on the D, the way she dotted her I slightly to the right of the letter. Identical. Still, there were no fingerprints, no witnesses, just careful, methodical fraud committed in ink beneath layers of carbon paper. The breaking point, a hidden binder. The breakthrough came not from Margaret, but from William "Billy" Haskins, the young postal assistant who had always seemed an unlikely suspect. After Margaret was placed on administrative leave, Haskins approached Cooley voluntarily. "There's something I think you should see. I didn't know what it was at first, but I kept it just in case." He handed over a leather-bound binder recovered from the trash behind the post office. Inside were old ledger pages, all with edits, scratched-out numbers, test calculations, faint pencil guides. And in the back cover, a folded envelope marked "Personal." Inside the envelope, a single page with the words, "April shortfall, 72.15 adjust in SDAMPS, record .98 loss/balance bank June 3rd. This was a rehearsal page, a practice breakdown of 1 month's fraud. The handwriting was Margaret's. Now Cooley had what he needed. The fallout. On March 15, 1963, Margaret Darnell was formally charged with falsification of federal records, theft of government funds, obstruction of postal audits. She confessed shortly after. "It started in '61, small at first. I told myself I'd fix it the next month, but it just got easier." When asked why, she simply said, "No one was watching, and I was tired of doing the job right while other people got away with everything." She received a 2-year federal prison sentence, later reduced to 18 months for cooperation. She provided details about how she'd altered deposit slips, rehearsed fraud entries on scratch paper, and burned discarded ledgers in her home fireplace. She acted alone. No one else in the office had known. A system rewritten. The Postal Service responded quickly. Within 6 months, the following changes were made nationally. Carbon copy ledgers were phased out in favor of triplicate forms, with one sealed copy stored securely at a third-party auditing center. Randomized ledger spot checks were implemented across rural branches. All deposit slips required dual signatures for verification. The Kenton case became a quiet case study in government circles. It didn't get headlines, but it made ripples. A theft of trust. Margaret Darnell's fraud didn't involve huge sums. Her total theft was estimated at $3,200, less than the price of a new car in 1963. But it exposed something deeper, that even in systems built on schedules, stamps, and structure, fraud can live in the gaps between trust and routine. She didn't pick a lock. She didn't break into a vault. She simply altered numbers, counting on no one to double-check the math. And for nearly 2 years, no one did. The post office continued its work. Mail arrived, letters were stamped. But for a time, in a quiet corner of Ohio, even the numbers couldn't be trusted. There's something almost comical about the idea of a turnip truck. The phrase itself has come to mean someone gullible. You must think I just fell off the turnip truck. But in early spring of 1954 in Logan County, Arkansas, it wasn't a joke. It was transport. A real truck, full of real turnips, and inside it, tucked beneath a false bed of produce, was nearly a week's worth of payroll for 87 seasonal farmhands. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the truck had vanished, so had the cash. And for months afterward, the small town of Boonville would talk about nothing else. How the money disappeared without a trace. How no one heard a thing. And how someone, somehow, used the most ordinary thing in the world, a root vegetable delivery, to rob them blind. A quiet kind of payday. The year was 1954. Logan County's spring planting season had just begun. Dozens of migrant workers had returned to the area's fertile farmland for early prep on potato fields, corn rows, and turnip patches. One of the region's largest operations was Pine Creek Agricultural Cooperative, a modest collective of 5 family-run farms. Each year, they pooled their resources for planting, harvesting, and crucially payroll. In those days, paying field laborers in rural areas wasn't done by check or direct deposit. It was cash in hand, often delivered weekly from Boonville's Farmers and Merchants Bank, counted and sorted on Fridays, distributed from a single on-site office. On April 2, 1954, a Friday, the Pine Creek Co-op payroll, roughly $3,142 in small bills, was packed into a canvas courier bag and loaded into the back of a produce truck for delivery. The driver, Russell "Rusty" Tyner, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who'd driven for the co-op for nearly 11 years. He'd made the run 100 times before. But this time, he didn't come back. The route and the disappearance. Tyner was last seen at 11:42 a.m., departing the loading dock of Farmers and Merchants Bank with the sealed payroll satchel, stashing it beneath a crate of iced butter lettuce. His destination, Pine Creek Depot, a 17-minute drive west via County Route 6. He never arrived. At 12:35 p.m., the co-op clerk called the bank to confirm the drop. They hadn't heard from Tyner since he left. By 1:00, a farmhand was dispatched to check the roadside. At 1:20, Sheriff Ellis Brantley was alerted. By 2:00 p.m., a search had begun, but there was no sign of the truck, no sign of Tyner, and no evidence of an accident. The turnip truck had simply vanished in broad daylight, on a stretch of quiet farmland where a cow crossing would draw more attention than a robbery. The investigation begins. Sheriff Brantley knew the community. Born and raised in Logan County, he'd seen his share of moonshine operations, land disputes, and the occasional hunting accident. But this was different. His first theory, an accident. Perhaps Tyner had crashed. A tire blowout, a heart attack, something innocent. But no skid marks, no broken fencing, no damage reported by nearby landowners. His second theory, an ambush. Maybe someone knew the money would be on that truck. Maybe they intercepted it en route. But the roads were too exposed. No one reported unusual vehicles, no signs of struggle. It wasn't until late that afternoon that the first lead emerged from a gas station attendant just outside Greenfield, a town 20 miles south. The wrong route. The attendant, Beulah Mims, described a sweaty, anxious man who pulled into the station at 12:10 p.m., driving a light blue produce truck. He asked for $2 in gas, cash, and didn't speak much. But when he pulled out, she noticed something odd. The rear of the truck wasn't loaded with lettuce or turnips, it was stacked with cardboard boxes that didn't match the season's harvest. And most notably, there were no Pine Creek logos on the side. Beulah didn't think much of it until she heard about the missing vehicle on the radio that night. A man named Rusty. Investigators began to build a picture of Russell "Rusty" Tyner, and it was more complex than his quiet exterior suggested. Tyner was unmarried, lived alone in a rented home on the outskirts of Boonville, no criminal record, no known debts. But one thing stood out. 3 months earlier, Tyner had applied for a commercial driver's license in the state of Texas, listing an address in Corpus Christi, a city nearly 700 miles away, and one he had never mentioned to his coworkers. He had also purchased in cash a used 1948 Chevy panel truck, color light blue. The records came from Marshall's used auto lot sold under the name R. Tyner, 5 weeks before the heist. It was clear now. The real Pine Creek truck never left Boonville. The vehicle that picked up the payroll was a look-alike. How the heist worked. Here, what investigators determined. Tyner drove the legitimate Pine Creek truck to the bank, loaded the money, and parked it behind a back alley. He switched to a decoy truck, one he'd painted to resemble the original, down to the shape and wheelbase. It had no co-op logo, but otherwise looked close enough. He drove the decoy truck to the bank entrance and collected the sealed satchel as normal. Instead of heading west to the depot, he diverted south toward Greenfield, then further into western Arkansas and eventually across the state line. The real Pine Creek truck was found 2 days later, hidden behind an abandoned grain silo. The real satchel gone. A ghost on the backroads. Despite statewide alerts and an APB on the vehicle, Russell Tyner was never found. Witnesses claimed they saw a truck matching his in Texarkana, then Shreveport, but no confirmations were made. Postal offices were notified, gas stations interviewed, no firm trail emerged. The stolen funds, $3,142, were never recovered. For months, speculation ran wild in Logan County. He joined a carnival. He ran to Mexico. He faked it all and lives in Hot Springs under a new name. Some believed he was dead, killed by a hitchhiker or double-crossed by an accomplice. But the truck was never recovered, and neither was Tyner. A man, a truck, and a week's wages gone in the time it takes to unload a crate of lettuce. But the real question wasn't just how he did it. It was, why would a man like Rusty Tyner, with no record and no debts, risk everything for just over $3,000? You would think that a man can't just disappear. But in rural Arkansas in 1954, vanishing didn't require magic. Just time, and enough space between the moment a man left town and the moment someone noticed. By the time law enforcement realized Russell "Rusty" Tyner had pulled off a switch-end run with payroll funds, he was already more than 100 miles away and likely planning his second move. Sheriff Ellis Brantley knew from the start that solving the case wasn't going to be about catching someone red-handed. It would be about piecing together fragments, as dusty and fatting as the roads Rusty left behind. A truck found a man not. 2 days after the theft, the original Pine Creek turnip truck was discovered behind an abandoned grain silo northeast of Boonville, roughly 4 miles off the main highway. The truck was intact, the crates of produce left to rot. The license plates had been removed and replaced with false paper tags, barely legible, soaked from spring rain. In the glove box, a torn map of Arkansas and Louisiana. No fingerprints, no satchel, no cash, not even a cigarette butt. But something else stood out. In the back of the truck, 2 crates were bolted to the floor. Hidden beneath one was a spare set of car plates matching the light blue panel truck purchased by R. Tyner the previous month. This confirmed Sheriff Brantley's suspicion. The grain silo had been part of the plan all along. The bank's quiet question. While the public still saw the heist as a bold solo operation, the bank manager, Mr. Cletus Ames, raised a troubling possibility. "I gave that satchel to a man I've known for over a decade," Ames told investigators. But thinking on it now, something didn't feel right. He didn't sign the receipt like he usually does. Indeed, the payroll pickup required a signature log, and the one left behind was hastily scribbled, the letters RT barely legible. In hindsight, Ames couldn't confirm whether it was the real Tyner or a look-alike. But surveillance wasn't common in 1954, not in Boonville. There were no photos, no footage. Just the lingering thought that maybe Rusty had help. A stranger at the diner. 3 days after the heist, an elderly waitress named Velma Crowley came forward with an odd recollection. On the morning of the theft, a man came into Donnie's diner just off Route 6. He sat at the corner booth, drank coffee, paid in exact change, and left after 10 minutes. Velma didn't know him, but she remembered what he left behind. He was reading a freight schedule, she said. Scribbled notes in the margin, had a black duffel bag under the table. She'd thrown away the paper but remembered the writing. Little Rock 5, 15 freight right arrow Shreveport, 9:40 arrival. That schedule matched a private freight line that left 3 hours after the heist. It would have passed through Greenfield, just far enough from Boonville to avoid attention. Enter Franklin DeWitt. Digging through Rusty Tyner's employment records turned up a name that hadn't come up before. Franklin DeWitt, a former co-op driver dismissed in 1951 for chronic absence and theft of gasoline vouchers. He was known as a smooth talker, drank a little too much, left town in 1952, reportedly heading for Texas. But there were connections. DeWitt and Tyner had worked the same delivery routes in 1949 and 1950. DeWitt had family in Shreveport, a city noted several times in early sightings. And most compelling of all, DeWitt had once owned a light blue Chevy panel truck, sold in 1953 to an unknown buyer. The name listed on that transfer, R. Tyner, but the handwriting didn't match Rusty's known documents. Coordinated, very likely. Was Tyner ever alone? By April 10th, nearly 8 days after the theft, Sheriff Brantley and the Arkansas State Police came to a troubling theory. Tyner hadn't just gone rogue. He'd participated in a coordinated, low-tech inside job, likely with DeWitt or another party. The plan was methodical. Use the known delivery route as cover. Park the real co-op truck in a hidden location. Use the decoy truck to collect the money. Travel south via freight line schedule or pre-routed vehicle pickup. Switch vehicles or stash the money in a third-party location. Disappear. It was too clever to be spontaneous. And the biggest clue supporting that: Tyner had stopped making payments on all his utility bills 2 weeks prior to the heist. The trail to Shreveport. On April 14th, a small lead surfaced in Shreveport, Louisiana. A boarding house on Farnham Street reported a guest checking in under the name James Riley, a man matching Tyner's description. He stayed for 2 nights, paid in cash, and left without notice. The boarding house owner, Mabel Creighton, said the man carried a paper-wrapped bundle everywhere, told me it was church materials, had soft eyes, didn't seem dangerous, but he looked tired. She gave the man's room key to investigators. Inside they found a cigarette butt in the sink. Rusty didn't smoke, per co-op records. A city map with bus routes to New Orleans marked, and a torn sheet of stationery from Hotel Iberia, a long-shuttered boarding hotel in the French Quarter. The trail continued, but now multiple sightings conflicted. Some said he was spotted in Mobile, Alabama. Others claimed he was headed west. One man swore he saw Tyner boarding a ship in Galveston. None were confirmed. A crime too simple to solve. After weeks of interviews, leads, and road miles, the case began to stall. No accomplices were found. No money was recovered. No prints, receipts, or radio chatter surfaced. The investigation remained open through the summer, but by July 1954, Sheriff Brantley issued a quiet statement. At this time, we believe Mr. Tyner acted with planning and premeditation. We are unable to verify his whereabouts or if he is deceased. The case remains under review. Which in truth meant one thing: they'd lost him. What made it work? The brilliance of the payroll theft wasn't in its drama. It was in its low expectations. Rusty Tyner wasn't flashy. He wasn't desperate. He planned with humility. He worked within a system that expected obedience and exploited that trust. There was no violence, no alarms, no shots fired. He just never arrived. And that's what made the town of Boonville uneasy. Not that someone stole from them, but that someone they trusted vanished without so much as a whisper of guilt. A farm town, a truck of turnips, and a man who may still be out there, walking quiet roads, paid in full. By the time the summer of 1954 turned to fall, the story of Russell "Rusty" Tyner had already passed into the realm of small-town folklore. Children whispered that he'd faked his death and lived on a riverboat. Farmhands joked that every slow truck on the road might be carrying turnip money. Old-timers at the barbershop simply shook their heads. He always seemed too quiet, too polite. That's the kind you watch. But behind the stories was a real loss: $3,142, wages owed to men and women who had already earned every cent. The Pine Creek Agricultural Co-op paid out of their own reserves to make the workers whole. It hurt, but the town took care of its own. Still, the question remained: where did Rusty go? And more curiously, why did he do it? A letter with no return address. In early November 1954, something strange arrived at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Boonville. A small manila envelope, addressed to the bank manager, Cletus Ames, postmarked from Oklahoma City. No return address. Inside, a single letter typed on faded onion skin paper. It read, "Mr. Ames, I regret what I did. I was not desperate but tired. Tired of working the same roads, lifting the same crates, being the invisible man in everyone's rearview mirror. The truth is, it wasn't about the money. It was about proving to myself that I existed. I know that doesn't change anything. I won't ask forgiveness. Somewhere out here, I'm nobody again, but at least this time it's on my terms. Lar." It was unsigned. The letter was dated October 29, 1954. Sheriff Brantley had the paper examined. The ink, the typeface, the spacing matched letters known to be typed by Tyner on co-op equipment months earlier. It wasn't proof of life, but it was the last known contact. The letter was filed and sealed. Tyner, it seemed, had not just vanished. He had chosen to become absent. Long-term theories. Over the years, speculation about the turnip truck theft only grew. In 1958, a private investigator claimed to have seen a man matching Rusty's description working as a dock foreman in Biloxi, Mississippi. The man used the name Charles Rittner and disappeared after a single paycheck. In 1961, Louisiana authorities investigated a man arrested for check fraud in Alexandria. He refused to give a real name. Some believed he was Tyner, but fingerprint records were inconclusive. The most credible theory came from a U.S. Border Patrol report filed in 1963. It listed a man named Robert Tanner crossing into Mexico near Laredo, carrying a satchel and traveling alone. No passport, paid a cash fee and passed. No one followed up. No one had the budget. And the truth was, by then, the story had grown old. Legacy of a modest heist. Unlike famous bank jobs or mob hits, the turnip truck payroll theft didn't spawn movies or headlines. It was too ordinary. No glamour, no grand chase, just a man who knew the routines, trusted the system, and disappeared with less than a used car's worth of money. Yet in its own quiet way, the theft became a case study for improving vehicle verification for cash deliveries, requiring dual pickups and signatures at both the bank and destination, verifying transport license plate at distribution points. By 1956, co-ops and agricultural employers across Arkansas had tightened payroll procedures, thanks in large part to a man who'd once delivered turnips and chose to take something else with him. What became of the money? No portion of the stolen payroll was ever recovered. But investigators agreed it was likely spent slowly. Small bills, no large purchases, nothing flashy. Rusty didn't want to be rich. He wanted to disappear. And it seems he did. Some believed he moved to Mexico. Others thought he died unknown in a southern boarding house. One theory even claimed he returned to Arkansas decades later, working as a janitor under a new name in a town just 3 counties over. But none were proven. And the most haunting part, Rusty Tyner was never officially declared dead. His case file remains marked Open Fugitive at Large. A final reflection. In 1983, a retired sheriff, Brantley, gave a rare interview to a local historian. When asked about the turnip truck case, he said, "I think Rusty got tired of being invisible. Some men break because they need more. Others break because they've had enough." Then he paused and added, "If you ever see a man driving too carefully on a back road, windows rolled down, radio off, wave at him. Might be him, or someone just like him. Because sometimes crime isn't about greed or rage. It's about a man choosing to vanish, and using the most boring truck in the county to do it." Some burglaries are fast. A window smashed, a till ripped open. Others are elaborate vaults cracked, guards dodged, alarms disabled. And then there's the burglary that happened in Dowagiac, Michigan in the fall of 1972, the one that moved like bread dough rising overnight. Slow, quiet, warm. It involved no violence, no forced entry, no ski masks or crowbars. Just a baker, a missing brass key, and $9,000 that slipped out the back door one roll at a time. To this day, no one can say for sure how it was done. But everyone in Cass County remembers one thing. It all started with 13 buns instead of 12. Rise and shine at Grady's Bread. Dowagiac was a town of about 6,000 people in 1972, known mostly for its rail yard, small foundry, and a few generations, deep family businesses. One of them was Grady's Bread and Loaf, a bakery that had been in operation since 1919. They served most of the county's restaurants and groceries with daily deliveries of bread, rolls, buns, and sweets. Grady wasn't flashy, it was reliable. And it was run by Ernest Ernie Grady, a man with more flour on his sleeves than ink in his pens. The bakery employed 11 people, 4 bakers, 2 drivers, and 5 part-time clerks and cash handlers. It operated overnight. Bakers arrived around 10 p.m., and the drivers pulled out by 4 a.m. That schedule made it perfect for one thing: quiet access. The first sign: 1 extra roll. On September 18, 1972, local diner owner Phyllis Talbot noticed something odd. She received a shipment of Baker's dozen rolls, 13 instead of 12. It wasn't marked as a special. No bonus order. Just 1 extra. She didn't think much of it until 2 days later when it happened again. Then again the next week. On the 4th occurrence, she mentioned it to her driver Mickey Alton, who said it wasn't coming from him. "I load what's on the slip. I don't count buns." But Mickey also shared something curious. The bakery's rear delivery slips had recently switched to a new format, with pre-printed totals and carbon copies missing. The slips now went through one person before reaching the drivers, a night clerk named Wally Venn. The ledger doesn't lie at first. The small financial staff at Grady's tracked deliveries with triplicate order forms: 1 for the customer, 1 for the bakery office, and 1 for accounting. Over time, the cash totals didn't quite match the bread delivered. Not by much, just small differences. $4 here, $7.25 there. Sometimes it balanced back out the next day. It took Ruth Masner, the bakery's part-time accountant, to spot the actual pattern. She went through 6 weeks of records and noted that on days where the rolls were slightly over-delivered, the cash envelopes returned were slightly short. It was subtle: a few coins here, a missing $5 bill there. But it always corresponded with specific drivers and specific routes. Only when Ruth ran a complete month's ledger did the missing money become clear. $423.67, unaccounted for over 31 days. The shortages always occurred on the same 3 delivery routes. The route slips had all passed through Wally Venn. The van and the key. One night, Ernie Grady decided to investigate himself. He arrived just after midnight, unannounced, and watched the process from the bakery's rear office. As expected, Wally was managing the night orders alone in the side room, where the cash satchel was kept inside a brass key safe bolted to the floor. Ernie had the only key, or so he thought. That night, everything seemed normal. But when Ernie returned to the bakery the next morning, he found something disturbing. The cash safe had been moved slightly. The floor showed a new scrape, like it had been rotated or jostled. The safe was locked. The cash was there. But Ernie couldn't shake the feeling. He called a locksmith the next day to inspect the box. The locksmith told him with a shrug, "That lock been picked neatly, someone's practiced." Who was Wally Venn? Wally was a local, late 30s, worked the night shift for 3 years, never had a criminal record, though he'd once been fined for selling bootleg cassette tapes in high school. He was quiet, dependable, and lived alone in a rented apartment behind the lumber mill. His coworkers described him as weird with numbers. He counts stuff in his head all the time. He's always folding slips of paper, little triangles, squares, origami-like. He also happened to be the one responsible for logging customer orders into the books, preparing the cash envelope, and marking off returns. Ernie was suspicious but had no proof. So he did what any careful baker would do. He set a trap. The sugar trap. On October 2, Ernie instructed Ruth to add an extra $20 in marked bills to the route envelopes, but only on routes Wally handled. They also sprinkled a fine layer of powdered sugar inside the safe. Ruth ran a full deposit count. When the envelopes returned the next morning, one was short by exactly $20. And in the bakery's back room, a small pile of sugar fingerprints smeared across the inside of the filing drawer. Wally claimed innocence, said the cash was counted correctly, blamed the drivers. But Ruth had her final proof. What the police found. Wally was arrested on October 4, 1972, and police searched his apartment. They found a second brass key custom cut matching the bakery safe, a logbook tracking dates and route totals with shorthand codes, $842 in cash, mostly in small bills and coins, inside a bread flour sack. Wally eventually confessed in part. He'd learned to cut keys during a part-time job at a hardware store. He'd used leftover order slips to forge records, often giving extra buns while skimming change. He called it evening the scales, a nod, he said, to how the bakery always favored the customers more than the staff. Why it worked. The baker's dozen burglary wasn't about greed. It was about invisibility. Wally didn't steal thousands in one go. He took tiny amounts, often less than the cost of a loaf. He relied on the repetition of trust. The bread still arrived, the shelves were full, the customers were happy. No one counted the coins. When they had 13 rolls instead of 12. When Wally Venn was arrested on October 4, 1972, he didn't put up much of a fight. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He didn't even deny that he'd been stealing. Instead, he gave investigators a calm, almost dispassionate account of how he had slowly siphoned hundreds of dollars from the bakery over the course of nearly 6 months, one coin pouch, one delivery envelope, one order form at a time. It was one of the most methodical petty thefts the county had ever seen. And yet to Wally it was not theft, not really. "I just took the difference," he told detectives during questioning. They got the bread, the drivers got the tips. The bakery never missed what it didn't count. It was hard to argue with the strange internal logic of it all. The paper pattern. In Wally's apartment, detectives had found a slim gray ledger. Inside were 86 entries, written in pencil, each listing a customer name or abbreviation, a delivery quantity, a notation like +1R or -2C, a single-digit code, SLPM. The codes were quickly deciphered. S equals shorted payment, L equals logged alteration, P equals physical skim, cash removed, M equals modified route slip. Each entry corresponded to a date. Cross-referenced with bakery records, it became clear. Wally had documented his own thefts. Not only that he had charted his margins, careful not to steal more than $10 in a single shift, with most nights closer to $2.04. He'd created a self-imposed limit, as if this kept the crime morally tolerable. Investigators would later describe it as theft with a conscience, or perhaps with a spreadsheet. A timeline of theft. According to Wally's own ledgers and statements, the scheme began in April 1972, following what he called a personal shift in loyalty. "I asked for a raise, got laughed at. I saw what they threw away at the end of the day. Rolls, bread, unsold product. Meanwhile, I was clocking out at 6 a.m. with holes in my shoes." His first skim was $1.78, taken from an overage returned by a driver who didn't count his own change. No one noticed. From there, Wally grew more confident. He padded order slips, adding 1-2 extra items that weren't charged. Under-recorded the cash envelope totals, keeping the difference. Modified route logs to obscure the missing change. Occasionally slipped in a baker's dozen, knowing the customer would chalk it up to generosity. And every night, He logged it all in his private notebook. Every dollar, every route, every bun. The role of the drivers. One major question during the investigation was whether Mickey Alton and the other two night drivers were involved. The answer, no. They never touched the money. They loaded what they were told. If they gave an extra bun, it was because the order slip said so. If the cash didn't match, they assumed the error was on the customer's end or chalked it up to their own fatigue. They were cleared of wrongdoing but left shaken. Mickey later told the Cass County Herald, "Wally was the guy who handed me coffee when I walked in. Never thought he was stealing. Never thought he even cared about money." The bakery reinstated new protocols immediately. Dual counting of cash bags, driver confirmation signatures, weekly surprise audits. But the damage was done. A town divided. Wally's quiet demeanor and tidy theft created an unusual local reaction. Some townspeople were furious. He robbed from a small business. That's not just money, it's flour, hours, real labor. It's still theft, no matter how neat it looks in a notebook. Others were oddly sympathetic. He didn't hurt anyone. If Grady's didn't notice, maybe they were making too much. I'd rather a thief like Wally than some punk with a gun. At his hearing, the courtroom was filled not with press, but with customers, neighbors, and 3 of his former coworkers. Wally pleaded guilty to misdemeanor embezzlement, citing full cooperation and restitution. He was sentenced to 6 months probation, ordered to repay $914 to Grady's bread and loaf, an amount negotiated based on his own records, and banned from working in cash-handling positions for 2 years. What Wally said. In a final interview with local reporter Norman Hart, Wally offered a rare reflection. People count what they can see. Money, inventory, time clocks. They don't count what's missing. An extra bun here, a quarter there. I wasn't trying to get rich. I just didn't want to feel poor anymore. When asked if he'd do it again, no, but I'd still like to give people 13 rolls instead of 12. Feels fair. Long-term consequences. After the case, Grady's implemented strict inventory tracking and switched to mechanical cash counters. Ruth Masner was promoted to full-time head of finance. Wally disappeared from Dowagiac for several years, moving to Battle Creek, where he worked as a file clerk for a printing company. No other charges were ever filed against him. Years later, he was seen back in town quiet, gray-haired, folding a newspaper in the same diner where Phyllis Talbot once noticed that extra bun. Not the crime, but the method. In law enforcement circles, the case became known as the Ledger Loaf theft, referenced in small-scale fraud training as a model for incremental employee skimming. It highlighted the vulnerability of routine cash handling, the value of cross-verified inventory, the importance of listening to unusual customer patterns like too many buns. No large sum had been taken. No alarms tripped. And yet, for 6 months, money had walked out the door in a canvas bag hidden beneath paper, trust, and warm bread. Sometimes, the smallest crimes aren't in how much is taken, but in how little effort it takes to do it. There's a moment, right before dough is placed in the oven, when everything is still. Soft, silent, waiting. The final section of the baker's dozen burglary isn't about the theft itself, not anymore. That part had been exposed, logged, and resolved in courtroom paperwork. But what lingered long after the headlines faded was the quiet psychology behind Wally Venn's slow-motion embezzlement, and the subtle fault lines it revealed in a town that trusted its neighbors by default. Wally didn't just skim money. He broke a rhythm, one that the bakery, the drivers, the customers, and the town depended on. And once that rhythm broke, nothing quite sounded the same again. Aftermath in the back room. In the months following Wally's probation, Grady's bread and loaf changed not in name or operation, but in atmosphere. The bakers still arrived at 10 p.m., flour still filled the air, and loaves still cooled on wire racks by sunrise. But the back room, once a casual place of shared coffee, folded receipts, and offhand jokes, now became a space of double checks and locked drawers. Ernie Grady, once described as too trusting for his own good, kept tighter reins on the cash process. Root slips were cross-verified. Envelopes were sealed and signed by 2 clerks, not 1. Nothing was taken at face value anymore. Not even the rolls. The legend of the extra bun. Oddly, it was the 13th roll that stayed with people, not the money. Restaurants and diners across Cass County began joking about Wally's bonus bun. Some customers requested it on purpose. Others avoided it superstitiously, as if it might be a trap. Phyllis Talbot, the diner owner who'd first reported the irregular deliveries, later told a reporter, "I don't blame him for the bun, just the books." And so, in an odd twist, Grady's eventually embraced the legacy, offering a baker's dozen special every Thursday. 13 buns for the price of 12, with the 13th stamped with a small imprint of a folded triangle, mimicking the origami Wally had been known for folding during slow nights. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew what it meant. A visit from Wally. In 1980, 8 years after the theft, Wally Venn quietly returned to Dowagiac. He didn't announce it, didn't ask for anything, just walked in one morning, ordered a coffee at the counter at Tucker's Cafe, and sat quietly by the window. Someone recognized him, a baker's apprentice named Darla Moore, who had been 12 when the theft happened, said later. He looked tired, like bread left too long in the oven, but he smiled when I gave him back his change, counted out exactly. Wally didn't speak much. He stayed in town for 3 days. On his last morning, he stopped by Grady, not to ask for forgiveness, just to return a key. Wrapped in a folded paper triangle, sealed with flour-dusted tape, was the duplicate brass safe key he had used all those years ago. No note, no explanation. Just a quiet return of what had been taken. Ernie Grady, retired by then, kept the key in a drawer marked Lessons. The crime that changed training. While never a national headline, the baker's dozen burglary entered training manuals for retail and food service management, especially in courses on internal shrinkage, employee theft psychology, trust-based vulnerabilities in cash-heavy systems. It was cited in a 1979 case study by the National Bakery Association, titled Crumb Trails, Identifying Invisible Loss in Small-Scale Operations. The lessons were simple. Keep a second set of eyes on cash handling. Don't ignore customer patterns that seem too generous. And always verify the little things like the number of buns in a bag. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about precision. Because Wally had used the bakery's greatest strength routine as his camouflage. A life in small folds. Wally lived a quiet life after Dowagiac. He never married, never owned property. But he was never arrested again, never accused of another crime. A former coworker later said he'd heard Wally volunteered at a literacy center in Grand Rapids, helping adults learn to read financial forms and write basic resumes. He also taught origami to children on weekends. He always liked folding things, the man said. Maybe it made things feel neater, simpler. How a small crime leaves a big shadow. In the end, the baker's dozen burglary wasn't about bread, or money, or even trust. It was about small deviations, the quiet spaces where expectation drifts slightly from reality. One roll too many. One coin too few. One man who didn't look suspicious, because he never gave anyone a reason to. And when it all came to light, there was no dramatic unmasking, No great chase. Just a quiet clerk, a drawer of marked bills, and a notebook full of handwritten justifications. Not all crimes scream. Some whisper, and some, like Wally's, just fold softly into memory. Like dough, like paper, like time. In the golden glow of 1950s Americana, the glass milk bottle stood as a symbol of simplicity and wholesomeness. Delivered to doorsteps at dawn, its thick glass clinked softly as it was placed into wire baskets beside fresh bread or folded newspapers. The milkman was trusted nearly invisible in his reliability. But behind the doors and the white uniforms, a quiet and intricate forgery ring flourished in rural upstate New York, using those very same bottles. It wasn't counterfeiting in the usual sense. There was no fake money, no forged signatures, just a string of manipulated milk deliveries, counterfeit bottle stamps, and a cashback scam so subtle, even the dairies didn't realize they'd been robbed. For nearly 2 years, the scam went undetected, run not by hardened criminals or corrupt officials, but by 3 dairy workers and a retired machinist with a knack for metalwork and timing. It became known as the milk bottle forgery ring of Fulton County. A time when milk was money. In the 1950s, milk bottle deposits were serious business. Customers paid a small deposit fee, usually 2 to 5 cents per bottle, which would be refunded upon return. This incentivized customers to leave empty bottles for collection, which would be cleaned, sterilized, and reused by the dairy. For milkmen and dairies alike, this system ran on volume and honesty. Every returned bottle meant a deposit refunded. Every new bottle sold meant a deposit earned. Multiply that across tens of thousands of homes, and you had a low-margin, high-volume system where even minor miscounts could mean serious losses. And that's exactly where George Branning saw opportunity. The man with the metal stamps. George Branning was 61 when he started making counterfeit bottle stamps. A retired metal machinist, George had spent most of his life calibrating industrial lathes and cutting dies for bottle molds in Schenectady. When his factory downsized in 1952, he took a small pension and moved to Mayfield, a sleepy town just east of the Adirondacks. There, George lived quietly, fixing tractors, tuning radios, and occasionally building custom tools for the local dairies. He also drank exactly 1 bottle of milk a day, delivered by Horizon Hills Dairy. According to neighbors, he rarely spoke. But when he did, it was always with precise intention. He didn't waste words, said one, or movements or time. In April 1953, George began experimenting with replica bottle-based stamps, small embossed letters, and codes that identified bottles as belonging to specific dairies. Why? Because I could, he later admitted during testimony. The bottles that did belong. In May 1953, workers at Horizon Hills Dairy noticed something strange during bottle sterilization. A dozen bottles in a batch bore their stamp, but the glass was subtly different, thicker in the neck, narrower lip, and with a faint green tint, common in older glass but rare in their 1950s production runs. The plant manager assumed they were just older stock returned by a rural customer. But as the weeks went on, more odd bottles appeared, always with correct stamps, but inconsistent shapes. They were all accepted, cleaned, and reused. No one had reason to doubt them. Until the deposits ballooned. A nickel at a time. By summer 1953, Horizon Hills noticed something else. Deposit returns were rising faster than sales. The accounting didn't make sense. Milk bottle orders were steady. Customer base was stable. Yet returned bottle counts had increased by 17% in just 4 months. The dairy initially blamed miscounts, believing drivers had logged returns incorrectly. Audits were ordered, training refreshed. Still, the numbers grew worse. By October, the company was losing nearly $400 a month in deposit discrepancies, a fortune for a small operation. And across the county, two other dairies, Valley View Creamery and Everpure Farms, began reporting similar issues. The crew behind the cream. By November, a state dairy inspector uncovered the link. All three dairies served overlapping delivery zones in Fulton and Montgomery counties. And in all three zones, returned bottle deposits were being submitted sometimes in bulk at third-party bottle collection depots rather than on delivery routes. Suspicious depot owners noted that a single man, known only as Henry, was turning in dozens of returned bottles each week, always neatly boxed, always clean, always stamped with valid codes. But something felt off. A tip was passed to local authorities. Undercover surveillance was established. And by January 1954, the ring began to unravel. 4 men in a warehouse. When police raided a rented storage unit in Gloversville, they found over 2,000 glass milk bottles, sorted by forged dairy stamps, a metal press used to emboss bottle bases, a series of metal dies, each mimicking a specific dairy's code, cleaning equipment, bottle racks, and ledgers tracking drop-offs by date. They also found $1,162 in cash, mostly in coins and rolled small bills. The operation had been running for at least 18 months. The men arrested were George Branning, 61, machinist and mastermind; Lyle Harper, 44, a former Horizon Hills driver; Dwayne Duke Riley, 38, handyman and bottle runner; Henry Marconi, 29, the drop-off man and cash collector. Each played a role. George created the forged stamps. Lyle provided route knowledge and surplus bottles. Duke cleaned and reboxed the glass. Henry submitted them for refunds across multiple depots. Together, they earned roughly $12,000 in deposit refunds, all from bottles that never held a drop of milk. A perfect scam almost. Authorities were stunned not by the amount stolen, but by how clever the method was. There were no break-ins, no stolen delivery trucks, no counterfeit money, just forged ownership stamps on real bottles, and a network of returns that looked legitimate on paper. One investigator described it as a fraud so quiet it echoes. Every detail looked right because every bottle was real. Only the stamp was a lie. But perhaps the most haunting part. During questioning, George Branning sat calmly and asked the lead detective, "If you leave a full bottle on a stranger's porch, and they drink it, return it, and get paid, who exactly got robbed?" The morning after the Gloversville warehouse was raided, headlines across rural New York carried the same stunned tone. Milk bottle fraud uncovered. Forgery ring exploits deposit loophole. 5 cents at a time, $12,000 stolen from local dairies. For most readers, it was baffling. How could a group of middle-aged men steal thousands without ever stepping inside a bank or carrying a weapon? But inside dairy offices, the scam made uncomfortable sense. Because it had worked not in spite of their systems. It had worked because of them. What the bottles revealed. Following the arrests, state investigators spent weeks sorting through the warehouse inventory. Out of over 2,000 bottles, 1,148 bore forged Horizon Hills stamps. 721 mimicked Valley View Creamery. 164 carried Everpure Farms' outdated 1940s bottle code, no longer in use. All had been chemically cleaned and passed rudimentary inspection standards. The forging technique was almost perfect. George Branning had crafted metal dies that replicated decades-old embossing styles, using pressure molds to imprint the dairy's initials and lot numbers onto cheap, discarded milk bottles sourced from auctions, dumps, and flea markets. Then, using mild abrasives, Duke Riley buffed the bases to hide micro-scratches, making the bottles appear lightly used. To most bottle depots, they looked authentic. To hurried dairy workers, they looked familiar. And to the average person handling them on a delivery route, they were just milk bottles. Route knowledge was key. Lyle Harper's role proved central to the scheme. Having worked for Horizon Hills for 7 years as a night driver, Lyle had memorized drop-off schedules, bottle collection points, which rural homes paid deposits up front and which returned bottles for refunds, which towns had independent depots that weren't directly owned by dairies, thus more vulnerable to outside returns. He also provided original bottle samples for George to replicate. Old crates, discontinued embossing styles, and real inventory lists from his time at the dairy. His insider knowledge allowed the ring to strategically target specific depots with forged returns, sometimes returning just 8-10 bottles at a time, mixed with authentic ones to avoid suspicion. It was fraud by inches, but inches added up, tracking the flow of milkless glass. After the ring was exposed, the New York State Department of Agriculture issued a forensic report on how the fraud functioned logistically. They coined the term milkless glass, referring to bottles that never circulated through actual delivery routes but were still used for deposit refunds. The insights: George and Duke could prep roughly 50 bottles per week. Henry submitted returns at 11 different depots, often under false names. The average score per week ranged from $35.60. On peak weeks with bulk drops, they cleared over $100, all in coins and small bills. The scam had run for at least 19 months. Total estimated take: $11,800, $13,200, depending on accounting methods. No bottle was ever reused by a customer. No milk was ever delivered. But money was refunded anyway. Reactions from the dairy community: public sentiment after the arrests was strangely conflicted. On one hand, there was outrage. They stole from honest businesses. This wasn't clever, it was betrayal. Every glass bottle is part of a system. It only works if people are honest. On the other, there was a curious admiration for the elegance of the crime. They didn't hurt anyone. No one even noticed until the numbers didn't add up. They exposed how lazy we'd gotten. The dairies themselves were forced to reckon with long-ignored vulnerabilities. Inconsistent tracking of bottle stamps, lack of serial number logs, over-reliance on visual inspection, no central registry for valid embossing codes. One dairy manager privately admitted, "We treated bottle deposits like loose change in the couch. Turns out someone was vacuuming the couch every week." The trial and the defense. At the group's trial in May 1954, all 4 men pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud, though George Branning insisted on reading a statement to the court. His voice was slow, deliberate. "We didn't forge money. We didn't lie on paper. We simply returned glass that wasn't ours, using stamps we made by hand, better than the ones the dairies use. If the bottle means money, and the stamp is what gives it value, then you gave that power to the mark. All we did was borrow it." The judge was unmoved. George was sentenced to 18 months in county jail. Lyle received 12 months probation. Duke and Henry were each fined $500 and barred from working in dairy logistics. It was a light sentence by modern standards, but for small-town reputations, it was a scarlet letter. The bigger impact. After the case, the state rolled out new dairy guidelines. Standardized embossing codes, unique per batch. serial registration of each batch of bottles, ink-stamped dates on the lip of every bottle to track age, mandatory weight verification for returned bottle crates. More importantly, the case was cited in national food industry fraud seminars under the topic Silent Skims, Fraud by Imitation in Product Return Systems. The industry learned that even small dollar items, when repeated at scale, could yield major vulnerabilities. And the greatest threat wasn't bold criminals. It was clever insiders, with time, tools, and a quiet room to work in. A quote that lingered. When asked by a reporter what he regretted most, George Branning offered this: "I regret showing the trick to people who got sloppy. If we'd kept it tighter, you'd still be drinking from my lies." When the last of the fake stamp bottles was finally melted down in a Gloversville scrapyard, state inspectors watched quietly. Some took photos, others recorded the moment in ledgers. There were no speeches, no arrests made on the spot. Just the end of a long, quiet con that turned glass into currency and trust into vulnerability. But long after the heat of justice cooled, the lessons of the milk bottle forgery ring continued to ripple through the small-town dairies of the Northeast. Because even though the stamps had been counterfeit, the consequences were real, and the systems they exposed were fragile. Where they went. In the years following the trial, each member of the ring disappeared into a quieter chapter. George Branning. After serving 15 months of his sentence, George moved to western Massachusetts, where he lived in a small apartment above a watch repair shop. He never returned to metalwork professionally, though locals noted he often carried folded paper templates plans for machines he never built. He died in 1973, leaving behind no family but a box of meticulously labeled metal dies, a shortwave radio, and a hand-drawn map titled Route Patterns, 1953-1954. It was donated anonymously to the state's Dairy Inspectorate archives. Lyle Harper. Lyle never returned to milk delivery. He worked as a janitor in a local school where he was described as distant but polite. He refused interviews for the rest of his life. He passed away in 1986. In his closet, his son found a single crate containing a bottle rack, one forged Horizon Hills bottle, and a note that simply read, "It wasn't the milk, it was the map." Dwayne Duke Riley. Duke stayed in town. He worked odd jobs, mostly carpentry, and was known for making intricate wooden miniatures of delivery trucks, milk crates, and rural stores. He sold them at local fairs under the brand name, the Glass Root. People who bought them never knew they were purchasing the aftermath of a fraud case. Duke was the last surviving member, dying in 1992. Henry Marconi. Henry moved south, eventually working as a coin machine repairman in Baltimore. He reportedly used his bottle sorting skills to excel in slot machine calibration. He never spoke publicly about the case. His obituary simply listed him as Henry M. Logistics Technician, quiet, precise, a friend to machines. A system rebuilt. The aftermath of the scam forced major changes in bottle logistics across multiple states. By the early 1960s, the days of reusable glass bottles were beginning to wane, but before plastic fully took over, dairies implemented barcoded labels on bottle necks, ink-based, not embossed, crate tracking tags with metal ID bands, central deposit databases, a kind of early analog ledger sharing between dairies. Some dairies moved to colored bottles unique to their brand, while others etched UV stamps only visible under blacklight, a direct response to the idea that what's visible can be copied. The glass bottle, once a symbol of purity and trust, became a small battlefield of counterfeit defense. And all because of a quiet machinist with too much time on his hands. The human factor. While the scam was undeniably clever, what lingered most for investigators was the psychology behind it. George Branning wasn't desperate. Lyle wasn't angry. Duke wasn't greedy. Henry wasn't reckless. They were Robin Hoods. They weren't criminals in the classical sense. They were technicians of the loophole, people who saw the space between policy and practice and stepped through it without hesitation. One investigator later described the ring this way. They treated fraud like a craft, like fixing a watch or tuning a piano. Every detail mattered, and they did it so quietly that we didn't notice until the bottles were everywhere and nowhere. Legacy of the stamp. Today, in the New York State Museum's Industrial Crimes Archive, a small display case holds one forged bottle stamped HHD 51, a photo of the Gloversville warehouse, a metal embossing die made by George Branning, a milk crate tagged Evidence 204. Beside it hangs a simple placard. A nickel a bottle, a dozen a week. 2 years of silence. One of the most meticulous frauds in state history. Closing reflection. It's tempting to think of crime as loud, as something that kicks down doors, brandishes weapons, or leaves sirens wailing. But sometimes, the most effective crimes are quiet. They come in the clink of returned glass, in the shuffled papers of overlooked refunds, in the faint embossing on the bottom of a bottle that never once held cream. The milk bottle forgery ring didn't seek glory. They sought precision. And for nearly 2 years, they achieved it right under the noses of those who depended on routine.